So, schönen guten Abend. I switched to English because the event will be in English. I'm happy to welcome you at the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin. My name is Alexander Klimuk. I'm head of the educational department here. And our guest today is my colleague from the educational department of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, who made a very long trip from Warsaw to Berlin today, Szymon Pietrzykowski. Who will give you a lecture with the title Will of Survival, Obligation to Witness, Rachela Auerbach and the Women of Oneg Shabbath in the Warsaw Ghetto. This lecture will take place in the framework, like as a part of the events accompanying our exhibition entitled Doppelt frei in German, or Liberated Twice, about Polish women or women in Poland in the beginning of the 20th century. But also this lecture is part of our very fruitful cooperation between our institutions, the Pilecki-Institut Berlin and the Jewish Historical Institute. Another fruit of this cooperation is this book. It's a publication in German language about the Ringelblum archive, with a lot of documents from the Ringelblum archive, especially interesting for teachers and educators, because we give here a lot of stuff for teaching about this topic. If you're interested after the event, you can grab one copy of the publication, take it with you. Szymon Pietrzykowski is a historian, researcher, and educator specializing in the Jewish history, with particular emphasis on the Greater Poland region. As I already said, he's employee at the educational department at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. And yeah, Szymon, the floor is yours. Please give us very interesting lecture, which you surely prepared for us.
Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Szymon Pietrzykowski. As Alexander already said, I am employee of education department at the Jewish Historical Institute, and today will be my great pleasure and great honor to tell you something about the Oneg Shabbath group, about the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, the most important documents that we have in our collections, and special emphasis will be put on the role of women, because also within a relatively small group of Jews and Jewesses from the Warsaw Ghetto, there were also very well educated, assimilated, brilliant women who contributed very greatly to the documentation and recording activity of Oneg Shabbath. So first and foremost, let me introduce you and let me explain you the term Oneg Shabbath. So Oneg Shabbath means the joy of Saturday in Hebrew. For Orthodox, for traditional Jews, the Saturday was the most saint, most important day of the week. And on Saturday, the leadership of the Oneg Shabbath group meet in the building that today is the headquarters of Jewish Historical Institute. Before the beginning of the Second World War, it was the headquarters of two very important Jewish pre-war institutions. It was the main Judaistic library and the Institute of Judaistic Studies. And during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, during the Warsaw Ghetto, this building also functioned as a headquarters of Jewish self-help. It was a charity organization that was independent from German, that was accepted by the Germans, and is also alternatively called the Coordination Committee. The Coordination Committee because it coordinated numerous smaller, below top bodies and organizations, such as People's Kitchen, such as orphanages, low case loans, and so on. And Emanuel Ringelblum, the founder of the Oneg Shabbath group, the spiritus movens of the entire war, was a head of a social policy committee within the Jewish self-help. And also this very important charitable activity serves as a kind of cover-up to the recording, to the documentation activity. And this is the quote from Emanuel Ringelblum that I think is quite important, and it sums up the methodology, the idea of Oneg Shabbath. So Ringelblum wrote, the Oneg Shabbath associates constituted and to this day constitute a unitary corporation imbued with a single spirit, guided by a single idea. The Oneg Shabbath is not an association of scholars competing with and fighting with each other, but a brotherly organization where everyone helps one another and strives towards the same goal. The Oneg Shabbath was a fraternity, an order of brothers who carried the banner of readiness to make the ultimate sacrifice and to remain faithful in the service of society. The emphasis must be put on the word fraternity, brotherhood, and today I will switch the main issue on the role of women. And I will try to present the Oneg Shabbath group not only as a fraternity, but also as a kind of maternity in which, as I mentioned before, women played a very important role. And the story of Oneg Shabbath is the story, first and foremost, of a document and people. I will focus in this section on the former. So during a relatively short period of time, since the meeting of the founding members of the Oneg Shabbath group that took place in October 1940 in the private apartment of Emanuel Ringelblum at Leszno Street, to the hiding of the second part of the documents in February 1943, Ringelblum and others managed to gather, to collect about 35,000 pages of documents. And these are the documents of various sources, because we've got, for example, questionnaires taken from the orphanages, questionnaires taken for Jewish deportees or refugees who came to Warsaw from Western Poland that was endangered by the German army. We've got also diaries written by Jewish intellectuals, by Jewish publicists, journalists. We've got also, for example, tram schedules. We've got, for example, posters promoting theatrical play that was performed in the Warsaw Ghetto. So the very broad collection, multi-dimensional collection of the documents, obviously, of course, are showing the victimhood, the martyrdom, this traditional story, but also they are manifesting the thing that we can name the phenomenon of the ghetto, that despite those tragic, horrifying conditions, Jews try to live and try to resist. And also the activity of Emanuel Ringelblum and the activity of the Oneg Shabbath can be understood as a special act of a civil resistance. At the very beginning of the occupation, at the very beginning of functioning of the Warsaw Ghetto, it was the only possible resistance at that moment. So resistant not by weapons and arms, that was the case of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, that was the final act of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, but by pen and papers. And very famous and very well-known Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer calls every types of resistance that are not armed resistance Amida. So Amida could be the documentation project that was started by Ringelblum. Amida could be the preservance of religious traditions, the continuation of cultural life, life on its own. Life will be the most important value. And another quote, I think it's quite important, Also, it's showing the methodology of the Oneg Shabbath group and Ringelblum. So the Oneg Shabbath, sorry. Okay, so let's go. Okay, the Oneg Shabbath associates constitute and to this day constitute let's move on to the documents. So I told you about the numerous and multidimensional documents that are collected within the collection of the Oneg Shabbath. So for example, on the left, we've got the announcement of the beginning of the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto from 22nd July 1942 to 21st September 1942. In a relatively short period of time, during the 2 summer months, about 300,000 of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were deported to Umschlagplatz, to Treblinka, and perished. So this is a very important document. And on the right side, we've got the address list of members of Oneg Shabbath. And based on this document, I could, for example, make a walking tour on the site of the former ghetto of the former Jewish Northern District in Warsaw. Another documents on the left, there is a statistical data written by Menachem Mendel Cohn, who was a bookkeeper of the Oneg Shabbath. And on the right, we've got a regulation of shops. That was one of the places in which Jews had to perform forced labor for German military complex, for German industry. We've got also newspapers. So on the left, we've got Gazeta Żydowska. It was the official newspaper in the Warsaw Ghetto that was published by the Judenrat, by the Jewish Council. We've got also example of a clandestine underground youth paper. And also we've got on the left a paper from a candy that was produced in the Warsaw Ghetto. And on the right side, we've got an advert for a cafe. So this is also, you know, the manifestation of the fact that also within the Warsaw Ghetto, we've got theaters, cafe, and the cultural life was still alive and still very much active. And another documents, and also because we are speaking about the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto in twofold sense. The first, the very direct, is the fact that those documents were hid underground and later they were discovered, found after the end of the Second World War. And the second meaning is the fact that it was a clandestine organization, that the documentation project, that recording, you know, every aspect of ghetto life, and starting from at the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942, when the first information about the mass executions on the Eastern Front reached the Warsaw Ghetto, it was also the activity of alarming the Jews and alarming the outside world about the ongoing Holocaust. So it was a dangerous, life-threatening activity, and Emanuel Ringelblum tried to keep it secret as much, and he was very much successful in this activity. And this is the evidence of the fact that those documents were for several years underground, that some of them could be destroyed, and some of them completely now demolished and unreadable. But it was also a very important task of the copyists. So each document, each original documents have got several copies, and we can, based on comparison of one and another and the third copy, we can recreate the story of the document. So this is possible thanks to the methodology of the Oneg Shabbath. And as I said to you before, in the beginning of the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, in mid-July 1942, when the surviving members of the Oneg Shabbath group came to conclusion that not only their life is in danger, but also their entire activity, this treasure that is more important than life, they decided to hide the documents, and the first part of the documents were hidden in 10 metal boxes and buried in the basement of clandestine Berborochov school at Nowolipki 68 in Warsaw. So you can see some of the metal boxes. And the second part of the documents this time was hidden in 2 metal milk cans, and it was in February 1943. We don't know about we don't know much about the circumstances of hiding of the second part, and the last document is from February. Therefore, it's very probable that this happened on February 1943, and this was also a kind of transitional period in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was after the end of the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto that ended in mid-September 1942, and it was before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So it was a transitional period when Jews already knew that the aim of the Germans was in fact the mass extermination, and they were deciding to hide or to pick up fight and to resist. And therefore the Warsaw Ghetto uprising happened. Vital in the finding of the first part of the documents that were discovered on September 18, 1946, was Rachela Auerbach, and this is a quote from the Yiddish writer Mendelman on Rachela Auerbach's speech on the third anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. It was April 1946, when the documents were still buried on the ground. And she did not make any speeches. She did not explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored. With a stubbornness that deeply affected me, she demanded, she called, "Remember," she cried out, "there is a national treasure under the ruins. The Ringelblum archive is there. We cannot rest until we dig up the archive. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I am not making this up. I know what I am talking about. This isn't just talk. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest, and I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive." And in fact, on September 18th, the documents were found, and what you see is the picture that was taken the day after, 19th September, because Rachela Auerbach was living not in Warsaw, but in Łódź. Warsaw was, as you know, completely destroyed after the Warsaw uprising, also after the pacification and the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The former ghetto, the former Jewish closed district, was also turned to ruins and rubbles. So it was also very difficult and life-threatening to find those documents. And the government and the society after the war could have other priorities. So it is a vital role of Rachela Auerbach to find and discover those documents. It's largely thanks to her. And when the documents were found, the first part of the documents in September 1946, and the second part buried in the same place in the basement of Berborochov school. It was found in the beginning of December 1st, 1950, quite accidentally by Polish workers that were building the residential area of Muranów. So a new residential area in the post-communist style was built on the ground of the former Warsaw Ghetto. So we are saying about the 2 cities. The city on the surface, this new post-1945 one, and the city below the surface, the underground city, that is the ruins and the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto. And when those documents were discovered, the benediction work began by the historians of the Jewish Historical Commissions that later turned out to be the Jewish Historical Institute, and collecting, segregating, conserving the documents, translating from Yiddish to Polish, because it is also important to note that the vast majority of those documents were written not in Hebrew, not in Poland, not in German, but in Yiddish. For Ringelblum, Yiddish was a very important instrument of national awakening, also a kind of response to the anti-Semitism of the Second Polish Republic and the critique of assimilation. So it's not accidental that the vast majority of those documents are not written in Polish Hebrew, but in fact in Yiddish. And later it had to be translated to congressional language. And you can see on the right side the complete editions of the Oneg Shabbath documents of the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. The first volume was published in 1997, and the second and the last one that is focusing on the activity of Hashomer Hasair, the left-wing Zionistic Jewish youth organization, was published last year. So the complete edition is finished. And right now our most important endeavor is the complete English language edition of the Oneg Shabbath documents. And also what is important, and I forgot to mention, in 1999 the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto was introduced to the UNESCO Memory of World Register. And it was one of the three first Polish documents. So it was the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Ringelblum Archive. The second one was Nikolai Copernicus' work. And the third one was the sketches of Frederick Chopin. So this shows the importance of those documents, not only for Jewish culture, but for Polish and universal culture as well. And you can see the commemoration of the Oneg Shabbath group. So this is the place in which those documents were hidden. And on the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there is a commemoration of the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. This school was completely demolished, and this is also a different address. But after all, a commemoration was erected and very well. So I told you about the documents of the Oneg Shabbath group. Let's talk about the people of the group. So we know that about 70 or 80 people were actively involved in this documentation process. They were writing the diaries, writing historical papers, conducting interviews, but also they were copying the documents. And we know about 70, 80 people, and we know from name and last name about 25 of them, including 7 women, and I will tell about them shortly. So this is another monument of the Oneg Shabbath group, this time on the Jewish cemetery at Okopowa Street, that was also erected on the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And we can divide the Oneg Shabbath into 3 circles. So this is the first circle, the leadership, and we've got Abraham Levin, who was a colleague of Ringelblum from the private gymnasium at Yehudia, because Ringelblum was a kind of Renaissance man. He was a man of many interests, of many occupation. He was first and foremost a historian. He wrote a PhD about the beginning of the Jewish settlement in Warsaw. And this is a sad paradox, a tragic paradox of his life. He was a historian of the early beginning of the Jewish life in Warsaw, but he turned out to be also the eyewitness and the chronicler of the destruction of the Polish Jewish population. And we've got also Herr Wasser, and Ringelblum know him from the activity at the JIVO. So this is a Jewish historical institute that was established in Vilna in the mid-20s. And Ringelblum was a worker of the historical department in Warsaw, and Herschwasser was an economist. And we can also say that Herschwasser probably knew more about the Ringelblum archive than Ringelblum himself, because he was responsible for the day-to-day bookkeeping, for the recruitment, for the distribution of money. So Herschwasser was a very important and very crucial member of the Oneg Shabbath, and he was one of the 3 surviving members. Of those 70-80 people, only 3 members survived the Holocaust, survived the war, and those were Herschwasser together with his wife Bluma Wasser, and of course our main hero Rachela Auerbach. So this is the leadership of the Oneg Shabbath. Also, the second secretary was Eliahu Gutkowski. He also, the same as Herschwasser, came to Warsaw from Łódź, and he was an economist from education. He was also a member of Polencian Right, and he wrote a very interesting, very important essay, a text about the black market, the functioning of black market within the Warsaw Ghetto. And we've got also 2 very efficient and I think most hard-working members of Oneg Shabbath. On the left, we've got Szymon Huberband, who was an Orthodox rabbi, but also he was a very keen, very talented historian, and he wrote about the spiritual, the religious life within the Warsaw Ghetto. He wrote about the destruction of mikvahs, of religious buildings. And we've got also Perez Apoczyński, who was a postman. He was working as a postman in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he was also very literary talented, and he was writing reportages, short literary forms about the different aspects of the Warsaw Ghetto, especially the living of the poorest, of the lowest echelons in the Jewish society. And we've got also the contributors. So those are the pre-war Jewish businessmen who contributed the activity of Oneg Shabbath Group financially. We've got the head of the Polish branch of Joint, Iskak Gitterman. We've got also a businessman, Shmuel Winter, and also we've got the head of one of the shops at Gęsia Street, Alexander Landau. But also, and this is, I think, our main issue of today, of this evening, we've got the women of Oneg Shabbath, and we've got within this group 7 women that we know from name and last name. Of course, we've got Rachela Auerbach, who managed the People's Kitchen at Leszno Street. She also kept a diary in which she described her experiences, including those related to this responsible work. Then she interviewed Jakub Krzepicki, who was an escapee from Treblinka death camp, and edited his over 100 pages long account. We've got also another surviving member of the Oneg Shabbath group, Bluma Wasser, and Bluma Wasser was Herschwasser's wife, and she supported her husband in taking care of the refugees, because Herschwasser, apart from being the Oneg Shabbath bookkeeper, he was also a head of the committee of deportees and refugees, so she helped financially to the people that came to Warsaw from a province, and also he was writing down and recording their testimonies. So thanks to Herschwasser, we've got the relation, the testimonies, not only from the Warsaw Jews, but also from Jews from practically every region and every city in the Polish occupied territories and also in the USSR. And she conducted interviews with them, with the refugees and deportees, which she mostly edited and transcribed. We've got also Cecilia Słapakowa, also a very important, very interesting member of the Oneg Shabbath group. And Cecilia Słapakowa ran a literary salon before the war and at the beginning of the occupation at Elektoralna Street number 1. In the ghetto, she prepared a study about the condition of Jewish women based on conversation she conducted with a dozen or so interlocutors. These were the people who had to change their lives completely, adapt to brutal ghetto reality, care for their own survival and that of their loved ones. And coming next, we've got Gustawa Jarecka, who was, thanks to her fluent knowledge of German, she worked in the Jewish Council and she copied and then secretly passed on copies of the German regulations to Emanuel Ringelblum and to the Oneg Shabbath. So these documents about the beginning of the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto is most probably taken by Gustawa Jarecka. She also wrote a shocking account of the Great Liquidation Action of the Warsaw Ghetto, entitled "The Last Stage of Deportation is Dead." And Gustawa Jarecka was a Polish speaking and Polish writing author. She wrote about a dozen of novels that was mostly focused on the conditions and the life of the Polish middle class, of the Polish proletariat. So it was a kind of, fashionable issue at that moment, and she was very much inspired by Emil Zola, by Don Steinbeck, or by a Polish writer Stefan Żeromski. We've got also Henryka Łozowertówna, who was a very well-known and very talented poet. And Henryka Łozowertówna in turn prepared communiques in Polish for those members of the Jewish community living within the ghetto that didn't know Yiddish, as well as conducted numerous interviews with refugees, fugitives and deportees from other regions of Poland who ended up in Warsaw, and wrote the poem "The Little Smuggler" in tribute to the heroic children who obtained food behind the ghetto walls, risking their lives in this way, often being the sole breadwinners for their families. And we've got also Gela Seksztajn, who was a painter before the war. In the ghetto, she devoted herself entirely to teaching and caring for her family. And about 300 sketches and watercolors made by Gela Seksztajn have survived the war, and they were buried in one of the 10 above-mentioned metal boxes in which the first part of the Oneg Shabbath archive was hid. And also we've got Salomea Ostrowska, about whom we knew very little. We even don't have her picture, but we know that Salomea Ostrowska worked in the quarantine, where the sick were isolated in the ghetto. She also conducted interviews with prisoners of the labor camp in Pomiechówek, quite near Warsaw. And those people, those women, are mostly known for their wartime activity, for their membership in the Oneg Shabbath, and for their documentation work. But they also very much contributed to the Polish culture before 1939. And for example, we've got the 2 volumes of poems published by Henryka Łozowertówna, Zamknięty pokój, The Closed Room, and Imiona świata, The Name of the World. And Łozowertówna was a very interesting and very eclectic poet, because in those 2 volumes we've got political manifestos, we've got poems that are very, spiritual. Also, they are based on her individual experiences, because Henryka Łozowertówna was studying in France, in the Grenoble University, and also she described her stay in France. And also she was sick. She was suffering from tuberculosis, and also the writing, the creativity was for Łazowartówna a kind of refugee, a kind of safe haven. And also we've got numerous poems about that. Also, we've got a short novel called Enemies, and this is about two children, Polish children and the Jewish children, that are competing with each other on Polish street, selling goods, and from deadly enemies they became close friends. So this is a very emotional and heartwarming poem. And also we've got the most known work by Henryka Łazowartówna, the poem Little Smuggler, about which I told you before. And this is also one of the sketches that was created in the Warsaw Ghetto. So this shows the situation of smuggling. Yeah, we've got some of the children that are coming through the fences, the barbed fences in the Warsaw Ghetto. And for example, these are the translations made by Cecilia Słopakowa of a famous multi-volume History of Jews written by Szymon Dównow, one of the first modern Jewish historian, and also Emanuel Ringelblum, together with the idols of Ringelblum, such as Meyer Balaban or Ignacy Schipper, were very much inspired by Dubnow, and Cecilia Słopakowa translated the history of Jews from Yiddish to Polish. We've got also several novels written by Gustawa Jarecka, about which I told you before. So this is 5 or 6 or even more volumes. And these are the writings of Rachela Auerbach. So on the left is her master thesis, because Rachela Auerbach studied psychology on the university in Lviv. And in 1939, he moved from Lviv to Warsaw, and she was very much actively involved in the cultural life of the Yiddish-speaking and the Polish-speaking intelligentsia in Warsaw. And we've got her post-war works. So Warszawa Savos, so this is the Warsaw Testimony that was published in 1974. And by Mleston Wake, so this is the last note. We can describe it from Yiddish. It was written posthumously because Rachela Auerbach died in 1976, and it was published in 1979, as I remember. And also Rachela Auerbach, because she was writing mostly in Yiddish, she is becoming more and more popular. So we've got the Polish translation of her diaries made by Karolina Szymaniak, she is the leading scholar of Rachela Auerbach, an authority in this issue. We've got also the English translation, and we've got also the German translation of Rachela Auerbach. So if you're interested in the activity and in the writing of Rachela Auerbach, you can also attach the German translation. And we can also say about the women in the Warsaw Ghetto. So you can see the map of the ghetto, and a relatively small territory, about 37 hectares. About 400 people were trapped, and obviously we have to imagine the tragic, the horrifying circumstances within the Warsaw Ghetto, the death staring on the people from every corner, and in this horrifying, terrible conditions, quite paradoxically, it was the women that adapted the best to this new situation. Quite paradoxically, because the men whose situation before 1939 was quite, stable and comforted, they couldn't found themselves in this new brutal ghetto reality in opposite to women. And this is also a very important, interesting quote from this work made by Cecilia Słopakowa, about which I mentioned to you before. So Słopakova wrote the study of a Jewish woman in spring, summer 1942. So this is the study based on about 17 interviews with women from different spheres, from different cities, with different life experiences. And based on those interviews, Cecilia Słopakova came to the following conclusion that is interesting, and I divided it into 4 points. So the first point is the resilience of Jewish women. One thing seems undeniable. This war has predestined the Jewish woman to be the provider of life, and the overall balance of her achievements and contributions in this is positive. Almost since the outbreak of the war and during the subsequent stages of our social tragedy, the woman has amazed people with her active stance in all, even the most challenging spheres of life, and with her ability to adapt to radical changes stemming from her subtle instincts of self-preservation. The unusual economic cultural conditions into which our life has been cramped have elevated the Jewish women to a much higher and more responsible level than in other societies, to the front line of the struggle. And another point that is worth focusing is the emancipation of the Jewish women. So the Jewish woman has penetrated almost all spheres of life. In some spheres, she has hegemony over the men, having become a structural factor in the shaping of our new reality, both economic and moral. She incorporates many models from her past experience into her personal and social activity, but she adjusts her experience to the new commands of life with subtle and often surprising intuition. She does this in such a way that her efforts bring about the most positive effects possible in our conditions, but the aspiration of the Jewish woman go beyond the motto to do everything to survive. She also wants to lay the foundations for future social economic revival, hence her drive towards various occupation. The contribution of Jewish women in this sphere is also particularly worthy of acknowledgement. So we've got the resilience, we've got the emancipation, and the third point will be the Jewish women as spiritual leaders. Her contribution, the contribution of Jewish women in the spiritual sphere, is significant too. She brings into our everyday life the refreshing spirit of faith and courage, the freshness of intentions, ideological content, and humanitarianism, and shades of heroism. She is entirely patient in her drive. She does not become easily discouraged by failures. She tries to start fresh, and she tries out different ways. And the following point, it could be the diversity of Jewish women. So the scale of their activity is broad and diverse. It is not limited to one type of work, professional and gainful, or three dots. Because the document is unreadable in this fragment. In most cases, the Jewish woman carries the burden of duties on her shoulders. She takes care of the home and brings up children. Such a diversity of occupation is a phenomenon true for women from all social strata. It is symptomatic of our times. And the sense of duty is one of the major driving forces of the Jewish woman activity. The telltale Machiavellism of her life also stems from her feeling of duty. It manifests itself in the extremely wide range of her stances, from heroic idealism to down-to-earth egoism or even deprivation. And this is precisely why, that is, knowing that she's driving by her feeling of duty, you can see traces of true heroism and the tragic downfall of many of Jewish women. And we can also see the types of women that were interviewed by Cecilia Słopakova. That also shows the diversity and emancipation that was mentioned. So, for example, Słopakowa spoke with the impoverished woman, with women working in the refugee centers, with independent women, with the artists and so on, with the teachers. Also, we've got the doctors, the waitress, so various strata of social lives that was mentioned earlier. And we've got also selected stories, so the heroes and people, the women whom Słopakowa spoke, are giving monikers. So we've got Mrs. C and Mrs. S, we've got Mrs. C and Mrs. G. And for example, some of the women, the first one, Mrs. C and Mrs. S, were smugglers. And because, you know, they were forced to smuggling the food from outside the ghetto, from the Aryan side. And the first one, Mrs. C, decided to stop that, you know, risky activity because this is a very important quote. The most important thing is life. Before I took risk in order to live, but what's the sense of taking risk in order to die? And the latter example, Mrs. S, after the birth of her fourth child, still was forced to smuggle, and after the announcement of the death penalty for smuggling, for crossing the ghetto walls, she was one of the first victims of this decree. And also we've got the example of Mrs. C and Mrs. G, who, in order to, live in the Warsaw Ghetto, turned to prostitution. So this is also that kind of stories. And we've got, for example, Mrs. F, who came from the same social strata of Salomea as Cecilia Słopakowa, who was an intellectual, who spoke fluently 4 languages, and after he decided to escape from the Łódź ghetto to the Warsaw, in order to survive, in order to preserve, she was, taking several low-income occupation, and also very important is the conclusion of a story of Mrs. F, that she could not count on regaining her formal social position and made peace with the new reality. And the woman of tomorrow, according to Mrs. F, will be a skilled craftswoman, and the only hero, the only interview that we knew from name and last name was Basia Temkin-Berman, who survived the Warsaw Ghetto, who survived the war. And before the beginning of the Second World War, she was working as a librarian, and also she managed to set up a library for children within the ghetto. And as she declared, it was even more satisfying than her comfortable, stable pre-war activity, because, as she stated, her work in the ghetto gave her much more sophistication, both because of its immediate achievements and because she was helping Jewish children and to prepare them for the post-World War. Also, she intended to interest the children in Yiddish literature. And we've got the July 22nd and the September 21st, the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I think the 2 most important accounts about this liquidation action was written by women. So the first account was written by Rachela Auerbach in her funeral poem Iskol, that was written in November 1943, so after the pacification of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, after the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, when Rachela Auerbach was hiding on the so-called Aryan side. Yeah, and she compares the Holocaust to natural cataclysm. I saw a flute once in the mountains. Wooden huts torn from their foundation were carried about the raging waters. And the same as the food was the situation with the Jewish masses, out to their destruction at the time of the deportation, sinking us helplessly into the lodge of destruction. So also another account is the account of Gustawa Jarecka. And Gustawa Jarecka wrote in her essay, the last stage of deportation is dead, about the inadequacy of words, but on the other side, the necessity to write and to take witness. So Jarecka wrote, "We have noses fastened around our necks. When the pressure abates, for a moment we utter a cry. Its importance should not be underestimated. Many a time in history did such cries resound. For a long time they resounded in vain, and only much later did they produce an echo. Documents and a cry of pain, objectivity and passion do not fit together, but the desire to write is as strong as the repugnance of words. We hate words because they too often have served as a cover for emptiness of meanness. We despise them for their pale in comparison with the emotion tormenting us, and yet in the past the word meant human dignity and was man's best possession, an instrument of communication between people." And following this thought, also Gustawa Jarecka wrote about writing, witnessing as accusation. That the record must be hurled like a stone on the history wheel in order to stop it. Let's continue. So another important date in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto is the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. What is important, it was the first urban type guerrilla uprising and the Nazi-occupied Europe. So Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were first to put up a fight, and later there were uprising in other ghettos such as Białystok Ghetto, Sosnowiec Ghetto, Częstochowa Ghetto. There were also uprising in the death camps such as Treblinka, Sobibór, and in some of the labor camps. And also we can say about the women of the Jewish resistance, and this is also a very telling quote by Emanuel Ringelblum, that popular fantasy also created a Jewish Joan d'Arc. At Świętojerska Street 28, the Bristol workshop, a beautiful 18-year-old girl dressed in white had been seen firing a machine gun at the Germans with extraordinary accuracy, while she herself was invulnerable. She was apparently wearing some sort of armor, said popular rumor, and later Ringelblum explained this rumor. Throughout the war, they had carried the women on welfare work all the time with great devotion and extraordinary self-sacrifice. Disguised as Aryan women, they had carried illegal literature around the country, managed to get everywhere. They bought and transported arms, executed death sentences, and shot gendarmes and SS men. Altogether, they completely outdid the men in courage, alertness, and daring. And we've got, for example, a poster made by a Polish Jewish artist, Zuzanna Herzberg, and we can see different Jewish fighters from different, political parties. We've got Cyril Biedkin, who was representing the drawer. We've got Newton Teitelbaum, who was a communist. Yeah? So this shows that also the multi-diversity of the Jewish fighters involved in the resistance. And also very interesting and I think very important person is Witka Kempner-Kovner. And Witka Kempner-Kovner was responsible for the first act of sabotage in the Eastern Front. And July 1942, she managed to demolish, to destroy a German train carrying weapons and materials for the German army. And the first, such massive, such important act of sabotage was made by the Jewish women. And also there was a song called the Partisanerlied, the partisan song, that was in honor of this tremendous deed by Witka Kempner-Kovner. And Witka Kempner-Kovner managed to survive the Holocaust, to survive the Second World War. And we also see the picture from the liberated Vilna in 1944, and we see Ruśka Korczak on the left and Witka Kempner-Kovner on the right. And in the center is Abba Kovner, another important, person, a leader of the resistance of the underground activity in the Vilna ghetto. And you have to know that in Vilna, it was not in Warsaw, but in Vilna, the first Jewish paramilitary organization began to function. It was in January 1943, and it is the Vereinigte Partisaner Organisation, and it was in response to the mass executions that were taking place in Ponary. Ponary was one of the places in which the first mass executions were taking place. Later we've got, obviously, Babi Yar and other places, but Ponary were first. And also we've got the manifest written and spoke by Abba Kovner and the New Year's Eve from 1941 to 1942. And this is the first Jewish document in which Abba Kovner spoke about the mass that in fact Germans are intended, the intention of the Germans is the Holocaust, is the mass extermination of the entire Jewish nation, of the entire population. And you can see on the left side the leadership of a Jewish combat organization, and you can see that it is dominated by men. But we've got also a number of women. And on the right side, you've got right-wing, another military organization that also fought in the Jewish uprising, the Żydowski Związek Wojskowy. So it could be translated on English as a Jewish military unit. And it's dominated by men, and we've got only single women, including Shoshana Emilka Kosover, who was also cooperating with the Polish underground, with the JOP, with the Jewish Combat Organization, and so on. So let's moving forward. I will skip this section because we've got not enough time. And let's move to Rachela Auerbach once again. So Rachela Auerbach was involved in the social aid, as I mentioned to you before. He was heading one of the People's Kitchen at Leszno Street 40 and acting as a witness of accusation during the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1968. She described her activity. Give me a second. After the leaders of the community have been obliged to leave the city and the country because of the great risk involved, together with the Polish leadership, a new group of Jewish leaders had arisen, and Dr. Ringelblum was one of the most important and distinguished amongst them. They took the initiative first and foremost in providing aid, since already from the beginning of the war, when Poland had collapsed, a tremendous flow of refugees arrived, and after the entry of the Germans, wave after wave of exiles from Western Poland came. Relief had to be organized, so this is the coordination committee. It was Ringelblum who summoned me a day or two after the armistice agreement, even before the Germans entered, and charged me with the task of organizing a public kitchen in the premises of the small merchants organization. This was the end of September 1939, and on the day that Hitler received the Great Parade on Piłsudski Square, later named Hitler Square, I was already on my way to the kitchen of the merchants organization with a sack of foodstuffs. And on the day Hitler entered Warsaw, the first 25 meals were already being served. And we can see I found in the archive of the ghetto fighter's house in Israel. So this is the only remaining picture of people waiting for a warm meal and standing next to the People's Kitchen that was run by Rachela Auerbach at Leszno Street 40. We've got also within the collection of the Ringelblum archive not only literary sources, but we've got also sketches, paintings, and photographs. And these are the photographs of various People's Kitchen that were functioning within the Warsaw Ghetto. So this is the People's Kitchen at Muranowska Street 14. This is the People's Kitchen at Nalewki 21. Rachela Auerbach was living at Nalewki 27, so quite near this People's Kitchen. We've got also a People's Kitchen for Orthodox Jews at Nalewki 37, at Świętojerska 42. So these are also very, heartfelt and heartbreaking pictures. And I think that they were took before the closing of the ghetto walls. So it was the early period of the occupation when, as Rachela Auerbach mentioned before, a wave of deportees and exiles to the Warsaw Ghetto entered the Warsaw Ghetto. And next to the, and on the opposite side of the road, on the opposite side of the People's Kitchen at Leszno Street 40, there was a theater called Femina on Leszno 36. So this is also the evidence and the manifestation of this phenomenon of the Warsaw Ghetto, that despite the terrifying conditions, also the Jewish intellectual and artistic and cultural life was still ongoing. So this is a poster of invitation to one of the cultural events. And I also found in the Bundesarchive documents some pictures that were took in 1941, in the spring of 1941. And this Femina Theater was functioning from spring 1941 to the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. So this is quite possible that it was took at the Femina. So another very interesting evidence, historical evidence. And also women were involved in the artistic and the cultural life. So we've got, for example, Marysia Eisenstadt, who was called the Nightingale of the Warsaw Ghetto. She had a very beautiful, high-pitched voice, and she was the daughter of the cantor at the Great Synagogue at Tłumackie. And her father, the cantor, wanted her to be a pianist, but she was very talented vocally. And finally, she managed to change the switch, the studies from the piano lessons to the singing lessons. We've got also Diana Blumenfeld, and the other three examples happily survived the Holocaust, the Warsaw Ghetto. Diana Blumenfeld sing this poem written by Henryka Łazawertówna, The Little Smuggler. Stefania Grodzińska was performing at the Femina Theater, and her husband was the artistic director of this theater, Jerzy Jurandot. And we've got also Vera Gran, also very famous Jewish singer. And Vera Gran was later, after the war, accused of collaboration with the Germans. And it was a very controversial judicial proceeding that ended up acquitting Vera Gran, and she later continued her career. And also Rachela Auerbach speak the following about the cultural life within the Warsaw Ghetto, and I will be coming to conclusion. I think this is also an interesting quote to share with you. The cultural profession in the ghetto, the actors, they too had to live, and the middle class also looked for sources of livelihood. For those active in cultural life, this was also a way of learning a living, and at the same time it was a way for maintaining morale. There took place concerts and recitation and reading of literature and meeting and speeches and lectures, although all of this was forbidden. These activities were undertaken under the pretext of relief, that is to say, they were acts of charity. And also Rachela Auerbach is speaking about the fact that Jews couldn't listen to German composers such as Beethoven, Chopin, Mendelssohn, and so on, but their love for Beethoven was as big that they decided to continue to playing him despite the fact that they were not allowed to do so. Yeah. And Rachela Auerbach also spoke about her appointment to the Oneg Shabbath. So the appointment of Rachela Auerbach was to produce a diary in which she wrote about her experiences directing, heading those people kitchen. So in fact, she wrote her diary, but also she wrote a monograph of the people's kitchen. And in this diary, Rachela Auerbach wrote about the inefficiency of help, and she wrote that I have been slowly coming to the conclusion that the whole balance of this self-help activity is simply that people die more slowly. In Polish it is called śmierć na ratę. We must finally admit to ourselves that we can save nobody from death. We don't have the means to do it. We can only put it off, regulate it, but we can't prevent it. In all my experience in the soup kitchen, I have not been able to rescue anybody, and nobody could accuse me of caring less than the directors of other soup kitchens. After the Great Liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, Rachela Auerbach was one of the few surviving members of Oneg Shabbath group, as I told you. Rachela Auerbach was appointed to interview Jakub Krzepicki, who was an escapee from Treblinka death camp, because at the very beginning of this deportation, the Germans was telling the Jews that they were taking to somewhere in the east when there will be better living conditions, when there will be enough food to eat. And in fact, one of the first deportation, the first people who were deported were volunteers. And the situation changed in late August 1942, when the first escapee from Treblinka death camp came to Warsaw, and one of them was Jakub Krzepicki, who was working the Sonderkommando, and his responsibility was to sort the Jewish clothing, the Jewish possession, and he managed one day to jump to the train that going with this stealed Jewish property to Germany. He jumped near Warsaw, and he managed to go inside the Warsaw Ghetto, and then he met with Herschwasser, he met with Rachela Auerbach, and from December 1942 till March 1943, Rachela Auerbach together with Jakub Krzepicki were interviewing, were writing down his testimony. And we can see in the front page of the notebook, we can see one of the pages of Jakub Krzepicki testimony written in Polish. And this is also the map of Treblinka death camp, written based on the memory of Jakub Krzepicki. So we can also see his picture and some of the quotes about his, his stay in this horrible place. And we will move forward. And this is also a very important quote from Rachela Auerbach diary from July 26, 1942. So this is the beginning of the Great Liquidation Action. The first deportation trains are moving from Warsaw to Treblinka, and Rachela Auerbach is giving her papers, giving her diaries to Israel Lichtenstein, to David Graber, to Nahum Grzewacz, to those who were burying the first part of the documents in the basement of Borochow School. And the main emotion leading Rachela Auerbach is the will to survival, but also the will to revenge. Very psychologically understandable emotion. After the pacification of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So Rachela Auerbach moved from the Warsaw Ghetto in March 1943. So it was one of the last moments to escape the Warsaw Ghetto. And she hid in the so-called Aryan site under the false paper. So we've got her Ken Carta, and the picture on the right is a post-war picture. I think it's the late 40s when Rachela Auerbach is participating in an exhibition about the women soldiers. Yeah, so the will of survival, it's one, leading emotion and one characteristic that could describe Rachela Auerbach. And the second is the obligation to witness. And this is also a very important quote on which I will summon my today's lecture. It is written in November 1943, when Rachela Auerbach, as I said to you before, is hiding in the Aryan side. And she spoke about one situation that triggered her emotion, her obligation to witness. Not long ago, I saw a woman in the streetcar, her head thrown back, talking to herself. I thought that she was either drunk or out of her mind. It turned out that she was a mother who had just received the news that her son, who had been rounded up in the street, had been shot. "My child," she stammered, paying no attention to other people in the streetcar. "My son, my beautiful, beloved son." I too would like to talk to myself like one mad or drunk, the way that woman did in the book of Judges, who poured out her heart unto the Lord, on whom Eli drove from the temple. I may neither groan or weep. I might not draw attention to myself in the street, and I need to groan, I need to weep. Not 4 times a year. I feel the need to sow Yizkor 4 times a year. So Yizkor is the Hebrew term for remembrance. And that woman who weep for her, dear child was a Pole, and she was publicly allowed to do so. And this is the situation of a Jewish woman in hiding. She was. She couldn't, express and show her emotion. So Rachela Auerbach wrote this funeral poem, Yizkor, as a kind of a therapy for herself. And this is another part. Yizkor, remember, O Lord, the soul of those who passed from this world horribly, dying strange deaths before their times, and now suddenly I seem to see myself a child standing on the bench behind my mother, who along with my grandmother and my aunts is praying before the east wall of the women's section of the synagogue in Wanowce, because Rachela Auerbach came from the little village of Wanowce near Tarnopol in Galicia, and together the same Ringelblum also came from this territory, from the city of Buchacz. So it's one of the similar attitude. I stand on tiptoe, peering down through panes of glass at the congregation in the synagogue that my grandfather built, and just then the Torah reader, Hersh Meir Itzik, strikes the podium and cries out a mighty voice so that he will be heard by men and women on both sides of the partition and by the community's orphans, boys and girls, who are already standing waiting for the announcement, we recite Yizkor. And the final quote, the solemn moment has arrived when we remember those who are no longer with us. Even those who have finished their prayers come in at this time to be with everyone else as they wait for the words we recite Yizkor. And he who has survived and lives and who appreciates this place, let him bow his head and with anguish heart, let him hear those words and remember his name, as I have remembered mine, the names of those who were destroyed, at the end of the prayer in which everyone inserts the name of members of his family. There is a passage recited for those who have known to remember, then and who at various times have died violent deaths because they were Jews. And it is people like those who are now and the majority. So Rachela Auerbach, as one of the very few surviving Jews, surviving members of the Oneg Shabbath, knew that with each, surviving, preserving biological life, there is a memory of life that perished to exist. Therefore, the obligation and the importance to witness. And this is stated in her, poem from 1943, but also she continued this obligation after the war, when he was a worker at Yad Vashem. He was working at the documentation department, and also we can see I think one of the most recognized and famous pictures of Rachela Auerbach. She was a witness of the accusation during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and also Rachela Auerbach was responsible for the selection of witness, because this is a very important moment in the history of the Holocaust, of the collective memory about the Holocaust in Israel and also among the Jewish American diaspora. So this is the event in which the survivors have the first spoke about their tragic experience first time publicly, and Rachela Auerbach spoke about the Oneg Shabbath, about the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, about providing this social help and heading the People's Kitchen. So she spoke about this Amida, this civil resistance. And unfortunately, on the same day, also spoke Itzhak Zuckerman. So this is the person we see in the middle, and Sylwia Lubietkin-Zuckerman, and they spoke about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Sylwia Lubietkin participated in 2 Warsaw Ghetto uprising, because we are speaking about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising from 19 April to 16 May, but there was also a so-called January self-defense. When in January Germans began to deport Jews once again, they were met with armed resistance on the part of Jews. And Sylwia Lubietkin was participating in the January uprising and also the April-May uprising. And it was an epic, heroic narration of martyrdom. And at that time, the narration of this, epic armed resistance overshadowed the story of Rachela Auerbach of civil resistance. But thankfully, and thanks to the activity of Jewish Historical Institute, this is also very well displayed on our permanent exhibition, which is completely devoted to this project, this documentation project as an act of civil resistance. This very much overshadowed aspect of life within the Warsaw Ghetto and other ghettos of life in the Holocaust is finally being looked upon. And to end with the quote taken from Samuel Kasov, who was author of a very good book that I recommend, who wrote our story, Emanuel Ringelblum, the Warsaw Ghetto and the Oneg Shabbath. And he wrote that much of the power of Auerbach reportage stemmed from her ability to navigate the cultural boundaries derived from a life that struggled different worlds, village, shtetl and city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles and Jews, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Jewish literary elite, and the world of the Jewish masses, religious and secular, diaspora, nationalist and Zionism. And on this I will conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Shimon, thank you very much for your excellent and very detailed lecture. It was a bit longer than planned, but I think it was worth it, and we learned a lot details about Rachela Auerbach, but also other women in the Jewish ghetto and the history of the Jewish ghetto itself. I would say we'll have like 7-8 minutes till the very end that we have to close this event. That's why if you have any question, maybe one or two, then we'll have space for this question or a couple of questions. So let me know if you have any. Yes, please.
Yes, who in 1945 or 1946 was interested in finding that archive? There wasn't a Jewish community anymore in Warsaw, so who took the initiative to, yes?
Yes, so it was financed by the Joint, so the international, American Jewish charitable organization, and the main contributor was American Jews from the outside, not from Poland, because in Poland it was about 100,000 Jews who survived the Holocaust, either hiding on the Aryan side, either hiding their identity in the labor camps and the concentration camps, or fighting as a partisans, and another 100,000 managed to escape to the Soviet Union and later returned to Poland, but very quickly when the communists gained power, and the political situation became very tense in the late 40s, they decided to emigrate from Poland to Israel, and this is also the case of Hirschwasser and Rachela Auerbach and Blumewasser. And the second part of the Oneg Shabbath archive, of the Ringelblum archive, that was discovered on December 1950. It was at the time when both Rachela Auerbach and the Wasser's marriage were not in Poland anymore. Rachela Auerbach they were in Israel. Yes, so this also shows very well the situation, the political and social situation.
And for the first part of the archive, they looked specifically, and the second part was by accident.
Yes. So the searching, so the excavation activities was organized by the Jewish Social Committee. It was a kind of semi-governmental body after 1945. And financially, thanks to the financial help held by the Joint, so it was, it was not accidental. And the second part, it was a kind of accidentally discovered by two Polish workers when they were building this, residential post-communist area of Muranów. But those documents were being given to the Jewish Historical Institute because there were still Jewish historians working on those documents, translating them, segregating, cataloging. There was still much work to do.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, then maybe one short question from me. We know that in the Warsaw Ghetto there were around 400,000 Jews, yeah? Like half of this amount were women, I suppose. And how representatively was the history of Rachela Auerbach? Was she like average woman from the ghetto, or was specific? If her story was specific, then to what extent and in which regard?
Yeah, I think that the last quote is very telling, because Rachela Auerbach kind of married the intellectual and the kind of people's person. She spoke Yiddish, she spoke Polish. Yes, so I think that Rachela Auerbach was a kind of people that went between. Opposite sometimes very politically differentiated sides. He managed to bring them together.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much once again, Shimon. This was excellent lecture, and thank you, dear audience, for the visit and for your today's attention. See you next time at the events of the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin, and also I encourage you to visit Warsaw and specifically the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which in his archives has the whole collection of the Ringelblum archive and an amazing permanent exhibition about this topic. Thank you, Shimon.
Thank you very much.